Hello, William. This is Patrick Pease. I just had a question listening to the Rabbi talk about the contradictions in the New Testament. I'm not a Christian. I am a Noahide. I run a Noahide community. But I wanted to see if we apply the same stricture with their contradictions as we apply to our own contradictions. For example, in Chronicles versus Kings, there's numbers of discrepancies between the numbers of troops that went to war and that died in battle. I don't have anything in front of me right now, but that's just an example. But back to you.
You know, what's very striking is we've been doing this show for quite a number of years, and I've been talking to folks for a very long time. This question should have come up, and never has. No one's ever asked that question. It's really a very important one. I generally don't deal with internal contradictions of the Christian Bible. I think the ones that are most relevant, germane, are those where the Christian Bible is inconsistent with Tanach, with the Jewish scriptures, rather than internal contradictions in the Christian Bible. The reason I say that could be some Christian scribe made a mistake, and that mistake found its way into the manuscript tradition, let's say the Alexandrian manuscript tradition, but there's an implication if there were no contradictions in the Christian Bible, which could have easily happened if at some earlier stage, if the canonization of the 27 books of the New Testament had not taken place in 367. That's the earliest point that we know of. We have a formal list of which books are considered part of the Christian canon and which are not. The Bishop of Alexandria will issue that decision. It doesn't mean it was all solved then, but that's our first list. In 367, that's almost 300 years after these books were written. In the case of Paul's letters, are more than 3 centuries later. So if that had happened, instead of Constantine converting to Christianity, had we had a earlier emperor who had converted to Christianity and turned the empire Christian, advocated for the church, accepted Christianity as a lawful religion, a preferred religion. So if we had Theodosius and a Constantine in the 2nd century, it's possible that at an earlier stage, somebody could have said, okay, we have the authority to clean this up and just do a kind of Tatian job on it. What he does in the 2nd century is, there's this one guy, bright fellow, toward the end of the 2nd century, who actually takes all 4 Gospels and creates like a harmony of the Gospels in a book called the Diatessaron, which survives. So he actually puts it all, so everything happens. I don't think he was doing that for theological reasons. It just he wanted to produce one gospel that had it all. So the point is, if let's say there were no internal contradictions in the Christian Bible, would that make Jesus the Messiah? The answer is of course not. The reason why Jesus is not the Messiah is because there's no relationship between what Tanach teaches about what Mashiach is supposed to do and what the Christian Bible and the church tell us that Jesus did. They're completely unrelated. And that's why we reject it, not because there are contradictions. Certainly, when we see that New Testament authors very deliberately altered the Jewish scriptures to make it appear Christological, so then we already have that, we have now mischief, we have criminal intent. When Matthew alters Micah, Matthew 2:6, what does it say in Micah 5:2 or 5:1? That's really very aggressive stuff. You know, when Matthew splits apart Isaiah 8:22, 23, 9:1 in order to produce Matthew 4, I'm not going to go into it now. So that's really very shocking. And what Paul in Hebrews did is so appalling that I really had when I was first started studying this, let's say 40 years ago or so, even more than that, I was not expecting that. I didn't expect it to be like anything remotely like that. The point is that if there were no contradictions between the Gospels within the New Testament itself, that wouldn't make Christianity any more true. It's just an indictment against the writers of the New Testament, the doctors and editors of the church. Certainly, very, very much so. It's very, very shocking. A question that someone should have come up with, but rarely does, is there are contradictions in Tanach, in the Jewish scriptures, where we have, let me give you an example. So let's say a contradiction we would find in the Christian Bible. The kind of contradiction, he mentioned a numbers contradiction. So you have how many women went to the tomb the Easter morning to find an empty tomb. Well, it really very much depends. You know, if it's Luke, you have 4, and John, you have 1. Mary Magdalene comes alone. So you have what appear to be number of contradictions in Tanakh as well, lahavdil. I don't think those are very significant. I don't think that the number of women at the tomb is a serious question about the veracity of the Christian Bible. That's not important. You've never heard me talk about it. I do have in Volume 1 an extensive chart where I go through the entire Passion narrative as they appear in all 4 Gospels and then unpack it completely and go through nearly 100 contradictions, and some of them are quite striking. But the numbers thing, I don't think a very significant problem, because Christians can argue that you can't argue from silence. If for whatever reason Matthew thought it would be good to mention only 2 women and Luke would mention at least 4, Mark would mention 2, the 2 Marys, the Christian would argue, they're not saying those are the only women, just for whatever reason, they decide to point out those women and not the others. Now, you've got to work out in your mind, is that a torturous answer or not? And I'm sure Christians would be much happier if all the Gospels just said the same number of women appeared. But these, I think, are just not really very important. There are answers that Christians have to it. They've been working on this. And frankly, this is the least of it. So let's take an example that this fellow called in. He asked about the number of fighting men in the house of Israel and in Judah. How many fighting men were them? So it depends. Believe it or not, there is a contradiction, and the contradiction is between 2 Samuel chapter 24 and 1 Chronicles chapter 21. In there we have a striking contradiction of numbers. According to 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 9, the number of fighting men were 800,000, and Judah was 500,000, 500,000. If we go to 1 Chronicles chapter 21, the number of men was 1,100,000, and in Judah was 470,000. So we have a different census. This taking of a census I'm not going to go into now, but just know that the census is going to trigger a very serious problem. The question is, how is this resolved? It's not difficult to find a resolution, because what we find in 2 Samuel are fighting men they call Anshe Chayil, which means that these are very highly trained soldiers, like we'll call them special forces. Whereas we don't find this text in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. We don't have that extra word Chayil there, and that means we'll just call it elite forces, Green Beret. And moreover, if we go to the very next verse in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, but not verse 5, but verse 6, we are told explicitly, although Judah was counted, but Benjamin and Levi were not counted among them. I want to mention one other thing I think that should be said, and that is that I could come up with much better contradictions between Samuel and Chronicles than the one that the caller put through. You can have much stronger contradictions than that. These contradictions I see off of websites, but if you actually go through the text, you'll have a lot more interesting contradictions. I have a video on the contradictions that are really staggering, and why does Chronicles present information differently than Samuel Kings? That's because of the author, the time, the audience to whom he was speaking, and his theological message. The author of Chronicles is Ezra. His audience are the Shevivei Tzion, the Jews who had returned back to build the second temple. Samuel and Kings is about the problems and the sins and mistakes and the errors that had occurred. Chronicles is not interested in highlighting that, because the first temple had already been destroyed. The Jews already had endured the 70-year exile. going back to our good friend, the gospel writer, Matthew. So Matthew is different in many ways than the other gospels. John is even more significantly different than the first three gospels, known as the synoptic, meaning two Greek words with one or the same view, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are essentially the same. There's quite a few variations, but 90% of John is found nowhere in the synoptic gospels. So I want to bring this point together. I don't think the numbers thing matter very much. I don't know how these traditions crept in, but I don't think it matters when it comes to numbers, because you could very easily come up with solutions to a number of problems. It's very easy to do with the Christian Bible. It's very easily to do with Tanach. With Tanach, I can actually show that there's actually a reason. I can show it in the text that there's a reason. What I think is very significant in the internal contradictions of the Christian Bible are those contradictions which really are telling a completely different story. It's not just there's a piece of information that's different. We're listening to an entirely different story, and they're completely incompatible with each other. The two stories are so incompatible because they're just different stories. The passion narrative and the infancy narratives, where you find contradictions that really there is no solution. Rarely do even Christian apologists deal with them. Let me just give you an example. Matthew's resurrection story begins in Matthew 28, the last chapter. We are told that early in the morning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary come to the tomb early Sunday morning. There's an earthquake, an angel rolls away the stone from the front of the tomb, sits on the stone. The women encounter this individual who what he's wearing is white and bright, and it's clearly they're encountering an angel who tells them that Jesus is not there, the tomb is empty, he is already risen, he's gone before you to Galilee, go back, tell the disciples that they should meet Jesus in the Galilee. They encounter Jesus on the way back from leaving the angel who has already informed them that Jesus rose from the dead. They literally meet Jesus first, and then they grab a hold of him, they worship him, and they continue and meet the disciples. And now, by the time they reach the disciples, they've got all this information. Disciples go back. The disciples went to the Galilee, and there they worshiped Jesus, but some doubted it. The story ends. So by the time the women encounter the disciples, they know everything. They know everything because the angel, the man that rolled away the stone, informed them that Jesus isn't there, and he has already risen. He's gone before the Galilee, and there you will see him. And they have it directly on word from Jesus, who repeats essentially the same exact story. They are thoroughly convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. They know the whole deal because they've got it now from two sources. By the time the women reach the disciples, okay? So that story works. Now, I don't want to compare it to Luke. I don't want to compare it to Mark. Mark really ends in chapter 16, verse 8. The last 12 verses are a later insertion. There's no resurrection encounter with Jesus. I want to ignore that. What I'm very interested in is John. And here, we only have to deal with the first two passages of John chapter 20. It's the first day of the week. Mary Magdalene came early. It was still dark. And she arrives at the tomb, and she already sees that the stone had been taken away from the front of the tomb. There's no angel there to inform her anything. She runs back and goes to Simon Peter and the other disciple, who Jesus loved, meaning John, and said to them, they took the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have laid him. So she comes to the tomb, there's nothing there. In contrast to Matthew, there's no angel there. There's no instructions there. She has no clue where he is. And as far as she's concerned, Jesus' body was taken away. Somebody must have taken it away, because if you put a body in a tomb and then come back very early Sunday morning and there's nobody there and the stone is rolled away, of course, the only conclusion you can say is someone came, rolled away the stone, and took the body away. If you don't have the narrative, the device that the synoptics use, that would have been impossible according to Matthew, because according to Matthew, she would never have stated they took away the body and we don't know where to lay them. Why? Because according to Matthew, she already knows from the angel. She already knows it from meeting Jesus. He met Jesus himself. They worshiped him. So how could she not know this? It gets more interesting. So Peter and the disciple, and they ran together. They went to the tomb. Mary is standing outside the tomb and she's crying. And as she's weeping, she looks inside the tomb, which she thought was empty. And as it turns out, she sees two angels in white sitting, one at where the head would have been and one where the feet would have been. And they ask her, "Woman, why are you crying?" And she said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him. I don't know where they put him." Well, how could she think that someone took away the body? According to Matthew, not only did the angel tell her, according to Matthew, Jesus told her and told her what to tell the disciples. She doesn't tell disciples anything like that. The instructions given disciples to go to Galilee in Matthew, in the Synoptic Gospels. Here, it's a totally different message. It's a non-message. Mary then concludes there is no Jesus, nothing. And someone stole his body away. That means he didn't rise from the dead. And as she's saying this, just then she turns back and she sees Jesus, but she didn't recognize it was. She didn't know it was him. And then Jesus turns to her and he asks essentially the same question. He says, "Woman, why are you crying?" The same question the angels ask. She thinks that he's the gardener. That's why he's out there near the tomb. She then asks him, "Did you take it away? Do you have something to do with this?" And then Jesus finally said to her, "Mary," and then finally she says, "Rabboni," or master. Those stories could not have both have occurred. It's not a number issue. The question is, when Mary encounters Jesus for the first time, does she know that, did she have the information that Jesus rose from the dead or not? Does she know what happened or not? According to Matthew, she definitely knows. By the time Mary meets the disciples for the first time, Sunday morning, Easter morning, does she know or does she not know that Jesus rose from the dead? I mean, this is not just a piece of information. This is the whole story. This is the whole point. This is like everything. This is about, do you know that Jesus rose from the dead? That's everything. It's not a question of what color it is, a different perspective. None of those answers work. The question that every Christian has to answer is the following. On Sunday morning, when Mary first meets the disciples, meets Peter and John, does she know that Jesus rose from the dead or not? According to Matthew, she very much does know the answer. She knows that Jesus rose from the dead. She knows where Jesus is going to meet the disciples. And that's her whole message. His message is, go to the Galilee and there you'll meet up. According to John, she has no clue. And in fact, we can see this very clearly. When she's speaking to the angels in John 20, she asks them, "Do you know where they put the body?" So clearly, she has no idea. Moreover, if you were to say afterwards the angels told her to comport with Matthew and the Synoptics, you have now more problems than you ever had, because when she then turns around and sees Jesus, whom she thinks is the gardener, she still does not know. And she asks him, "Do you know where it is? Did you put him anywhere?" She doesn't know. That means here we are encountering a different story. This is not a numbers issue. This is not if she got there, how many days was Jesus in the tomb? Was it 3 days and 3 nights or 3 days and 2 nights? Those are contradictions, but there are solutions. You can come up with solutions. You have to decide if those solutions are forced and torturous and reverse engineered, or do they really match? Is there some reason for it? And that's a decision. That's your call, not mine. But this is not important. What is significant here is that John is telling us a completely different story, which is entirely incompatible with the Synoptic Gospels. What is important is, what is the story? What's being conveyed? What happened? Just what happened? When we see a contradiction, we're looking for, give me a rhyme or reason for this. If you just say, how many men were there, and one is rounding it off, or the text is actually telling you Benjamin and Levi are not counted, those are totally unimportant. One is telling you these are fighting men, these are elite soldiers. We right away, the author is in Tanach is burying information in there. Moreover, we can then go, there's a discovery here that Benjamin and Levi were excluded in one census because Levi had to be out. They had to make sure nothing happened to them. And Benjamin was almost a decimated tribe. So, wow, this is so interesting. So Ezra HaSefer does this carefully. It just makes a warning. I want to make this point, theological point here. Here's a piece so you understand why I'm doing it. Warning, warning. I say I have a video on this, on the entire book of Chronicles. His history is the reason why it was written, because too many people don't read the book of Chronicles because they feel, well, I read Samuel and Kings, so isn't it the same thing or just a huge genealogy? It isn't. Chronicles emphasizing the fact that the Davidic dynasty is forever and can never be broken. And that's the point of Chronicles. And it's to tell a returned nation that has been shattered by a Babylonian exile that there's hope and God's glory is here and the Davidic dynasty is permanent and that the glory that Hashem spoke of is restored and it's okay now, things are going to be fine. And we see that just coming through everywhere in Zechariah. The difference is that when you are mining out other so-called holy books, you can come out with resolutions and then you have to figure out if they're satisfying or not. With Tanach, when you actually figure out the reason, it's not only you solve the problem, but you've encountered a discovery. You dig, and not only do you find that they aren't contradictory, but you discover gold. You discover diamonds. Kiss me with the kisses of thy lips, for thy love is better than wine. It's so delicious. When you look at Tanakh, the contradictions are fabulous, because if you study it properly, you actually dig. And then when you dig, diamonds. Oh, it's beautiful. Oh, wow, this just blew my mind away. Whereas in other books, you go and go, all right, I don't know, is this forced or not forced? In other books on this very significant contradictions, there's actually a theological reason why he deliberately lied and changed it. And that's very, very significant. And I hope that helps. I thank you very much for joining and asking a question that I waited 40 years to be asked. So thank you and shalom.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ועת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה